Awesome. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dominic. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Anya and Rod and all the event organizers for inviting me here today. I think I have probably the shortest travel distance to this event venue. I live about 5 minutes around the corner. So it's wonderful to be here and to see all these great people. I think Dominic in the previous session spoke about the 4 great houses that are required to solve some of the problems here, looking across government, industry, obviously producers, and into some of the technology parts. I operate within the 5th house, I suppose, around finance. How do we finance all of this? Big ambitious targets. I need to bring together a range of different stakeholders. And I suppose most importantly, operating at a scale where small scale local farmers and producers can also be able to access some of the opportunities and the solutions that we're talking about. So that's a little bit of the role that I come from. I work for a firm called Pollination. Pollination is a relatively new firm. We're an impact investment and advisory firm focused exclusively on climate and nature. We're headquartered in Sydney, Australia. We have offices in the States, in the UK, in Singapore, and also in Australia. And I'm based here in Hanoi as the one Aussie outlier. The work that we do is we kind of have this model where we're working across both advisory and investment. So advisory is on solutions and strategy with a range of different organizations, both government and non-government. And then we're pulling through the identification of those solutions into our investments business. We have an asset management fund, which we run with HSBC, which the first of which has been a $1 billion very successful deployment of funds exclusively focused on nature-based solutions. And that involved, for example, the world's largest mangrove restoration project in Pakistan. But we're now about to launch both a venture capital fund and an additional asset management fund, which is starting to focus on some of the things we've been talking about today. How do we actually scale up sustainable finance that is delivering both net zero and nature positive targets? And how do we make that finance accessible to those who, as we heard in Ben's previous presentation, have very clear cost constraints around their ability to finance this solution? So that's our investments business. We also operate a project origination business. So if there's a need for on-ground support to develop or originate a project, we have that part, and we have a foundation as well, which is where we do our community engagement and our consultation work. So we had a really exciting ride over the last 4 years. We've had a really strong, deep history in agriculture and in food and fiber systems. AACO was one of our first clients, a large pastoral company. We've made early investments in some of the methane reduction feed substitute businesses we've heard speak about today. And we're increasingly working with, intentionally, with some of those actors across the value chain, working with the likes of McDonald's and Woolworths around their net zero ambition and how they can pass down some of their solutions down to their producers in their value chain. And also starting to increasingly work across Southeast Asia in this space. So just today, I thought was just really a chance. We've heard some fantastic kind of technical pathways and technical solutions, really just to kind of have a look back in terms of what, with my investor hat, even though I sit within the advisory business, but within our investor hat on, what are we looking for? And what are we looking for in terms of solutions? Solutions that we can export from Australia into the Vietnamese market and from the Vietnamese market elsewhere, to try to start to give those ideas around the investability and the financeability of some of these products and solutions. So from our work that we've done over the last 4 years, what we're finding is there is a really clear ambition to finance and invest in solutions and projects that deliver scale. And that scale of impact in terms of the area and the size, so dealing with the big end of town, with larger companies, with large land holdings, but also scale in terms of impact, where it can demonstrate in a relatively short, or at least measurable short to medium term impact in terms of ambitious targets around net zero. So that's where most of the sustainable finance is flowing. What this also means is that this is really hard to access for many of the smaller scales of producers. And I haven't spoken to Ben about his request from a large pastoral company to make this cost neutral or low cost. But I'm sure if we're talking to many of the Vietnamese producers, those who have very small herds and small sizes, that they're going to be dealing in a situation where there is no allowance to invest into these solutions, and they're needing for those to be borne by others across the value chain. So these requirement to shift systems by actually focusing on what would work and what would be accessible for smaller scale producers is something that we've found consistently. Even if we're working with a large producer, even if we're working with an investor that's looking at large scale, how would this play out and how would this work out for a small scale producer? We've also found through our work is that there is, over the last 2 years, been a plethora of new initiatives, funds, grants, frameworks to be able to actually provide possible pathways for producers to access finance. But what we're finding is that they're, in many cases, overwhelmed by the range of different financing solutions and the pathways to accessing them. The information they need to be able to gain funding or to apply for funding is also really challenging. So there may be a need for solutions and potentially finance solutions to actually navigate through this pathway of different investment opportunities. We're also seeing is that many of the finance solutions are designed at a bilateral scale. So they may be between big retailers and government. They may be with large producers and industry. And how they actually relate to others across the value chain is something that's been really quite clear in our work. And so there's a need to, once again, navigate through this large plethora of new frameworks. So this is a very kind of a standard investment framework that we apply to all of our work, both in relation to food and fiber, industry and energy, and also in terms of environmental markets. That taking this systemic approach and seeing if financing solutions tick all of these boxes, or at least the majority of these boxes, is something that's really important. And I think it's relevant for this conversation today. So understanding the frameworks and the standards, how can producers be given with the information to understand new reporting requirements and new reporting frameworks, particularly around finance? The banks who are signing up to new disclosure frameworks and reporting frameworks for climate, net zero, and nature are pushing that down onto producers for them to also report up. So how can we, through capacity building and new data and technology solutions, can we support those farmers to understand and gain benefit and opportunity from those frameworks, as opposed to seeing it as a risk or reporting burden? Understanding performance is really key and really critical. Really critical to understanding that return on the investment of any new intervention or technology, but also being able to track and monitor progress over time. So any technology or any solution that goes up for investment, if it needs to be actually demonstrating that performance gain or that performance benefit, is really important. Understanding planning and financing practice changes is also really important. So seeing that theory of change. So when there is an investment placed into a farming system, being able to track and monitor what those progresses are, and also seeing that there's going to be measurable targets over time. In many cases, finance, whether it's through linked loans, or whether it's through capital outlay, or whether it's through direct investment, there will be progress targets, there'll be milestones, and linking that both to financial and non-financial performance in the system is something that's really critical. And also we're seeing through both implementing practice changes and also through monitoring is that technology that supports with both on-ground and remote assessment and monitoring of some of these interventions is really important. And finally, the final aspect around leveraging improved performance. We've heard about this in the speakers in this session, is making sure that any investment, whether it's through feed additives or whether it's changes in efficiency of production or different technologies, needs to be linked to actually having that improved performance on the farm system. So one thing that we did in considering this session was actually seeing some of the really clear market signals that Vietnam has already made. We've heard about this in the early session around the greenhouse gas and the net zero commitments within Vietnam. But there are a number of frameworks that Vietnam has already signaled that they've made around the role of agriculture and sustainable agriculture in making this change. Signing up to net zero by 2050, the Paris requirement, the role of agriculture in both reporting and reducing their emission reductions, but also clear signals around the emergence of a local domestic carbon market, and the role of agriculture as a solution provider has also been really clearly signaled. COP26 and the methane pledge and Vietnam's role in terms of being a key contributor to those emission reductions. We heard about the reduction in emissions by 2030, that 30% target, plays a lot to one of the technology solutions we've heard from Kwafi and MLA earlier today. And also in terms of some non-pure agricultural players, such as IUCN and UNEP, in terms of their role in providing data systems based here in Vietnam that enable both water efficiency and also land use efficiency in terms of the role of agriculture in supporting those transitions. And then also finally, in terms of changes in monitoring practices and the need to originate data that's local and domestic that can be used to provide some of this monitoring. So we've seen the number of market signals within Vietnam, which will support to the accessibility to some of these finance solutions. Now, just lessons from Australia in terms of what we've seen. This is just two examples over the last year and a half. We've seen around Woolworths in terms of their $700 million sustainability-linked loan partnership and wanting to actually provide those loans as incentives to those throughout the value chain. So originally, in their original design, they were focusing at the large end of town, those that they had direct production systems and production houses. But now they've actually looked to split that linked loan so they can provide half of that finance directly to producers and farmers. And in terms of Woolworths and their demand and their value chain outside of Australia, there's also been consideration about how they can replicate that as a regional loan or a regional finance structure. Another interesting trend has been Queensland Investment Corp's investment in NAPCO, and that's been directly linked through the signals and the market signals to being able to put product onto the market. And so the demand and the changing demand of consumers to be able to access that. So a direct investment by a government-owned investment corporation, and you have retailers also allocating capital and finance, both of those linked to measurable outcomes around both net zero and nature performance. So just in terms of wrapping up, what we're kind of seeing is that from a finance perspective, they're looking, the need is to make the transition as easy as possible, to make sure that the finance is as accessible as possible. And even though scale from an investor's perspective, big loans, big transactions, big finance playing out over large landscapes is the perfect scenario, it still needs to be accessible and understandable by producers at their various different stages in the production cycle. So just finally, in terms of a few takeaways for financing the net zero transition in Vietnam. So internal capability is something we've heard about a lot throughout the session today. The need to support producers in accessing the available technology, the viability and the effectiveness of different technologies as it relates to production systems. Designing financial products with a user experience lens. So what that actually means is that the producer can see the range of different financial products and the various different incentives and benefits and risks and challenges around entering into or accessing some of those linked loans. And obviously coordinating capital deployment so it's used in the most effective location in the most effective way. And then obviously the investment in solutions, the ideas that we've heard coming out of Australia and that we hear continually across the region, making sure that they're accessible for a range of different producers here in Vietnam. The role of development finance is also really key in making sure that where there is an opportunity to upscale and to increase impact around certain technologies or ideas, that we're also having conversations with development finance in terms of bringing on board their support for co-financing. And also we've talked about the role of the consumer here in Vietnam and also overseas, to be able to understand what kind of premium they may place on some of these products coming out of this initiative. So I might wrap up there. And I think we may have a moment for a few questions, but just to give you a bit of an overview of those trends we're seeing in finance. Thank you.